All right. Hello, everybody. My name is Chris Kuchman. I hope everyone's staying safe and keeping sane during these, what's hopefully our last lockdown that we're ever going to have to experience. On behalf of Trisura Guarantee, welcome to the last session of the day. Trisura has been a big supporter of the OGCA, specifically the Symposium, since Trisura's inception 15 years ago. I think I could speak for everyone watching today, and I think a few people made some comments during the sessions that while actually this venue has been great today and the conversations and speakers have been great, nothing replaces the real thing. So we're all going to have a greater appreciation the next time that we're all together in person safely. Trisura is pleased to answer our last session of the day, working with consultants. For those attending previous symposiums, you'll likely agree that the last session on the Friday has always been the best session, mainly being that it was the lead into the mingling and cocktails before dinner. While mingling in lockdown might be out this year, I'm sure we can all still enjoy a cocktail after the session, getting ready to enjoy what's hopefully a great weekend and watching some good golf on TV. Until then, and without further ado, I'd like to introduce T. Gardner of Singleton, Urquhart, Reynolds, Vogel, LLP to kick things off. Jesse?
Thanks a lot, Chris. And thanks to everyone for joining us at the end of the day for this last session. We're going to try and make it an interesting one. We have some excellent panelists with us today for this discussion on working with consultants. So we have Bruce Matthews, Executive Director of the Association of Consulting Engineering Companies. We have Jason Anibale, partner in the Construction Infrastructure Group at Macmillan and the National Co-Chair of Construction. Jeff Shantz, VP of Project Development at Malul Blamey Construction. And Joseph Ciancimino, Senior Director of People and Places at Jacobs. So the focus of our discussion today during this last session will be on how to work effectively with consultants on projects of varying sizes and different types. We're going to aim to identify some of the challenges that can be faced with that relationship on these projects and discuss how to work collaboratively to avoid and resolve some of those challenges. So ultimately, a strong positive relationship between the contractor and the consultant is critical for a successful delivery of a project. So we're hoping to dive into some of these details and discuss some of our experiences. So we have a number of topics to discuss today. The first is in relation to project delivery method and how that is a factor in the relationship between the consultant and the contractor. So Joseph, I'll turn it over to you. How does the project or contract model, so design build, design bid build, P3 or CCDC, impact the relationship between the owner, consultant, and general contractor, and what issues arise as a result of those different models? How can they be addressed?
All right, thanks. Thank you, Jesse. Thanks for the introduction. I've had the opportunity to work on large-scale programs throughout the world. I currently work for a consultant, but I've also been on the other side working for a general contractor, as well as being part of the owner's team. So I've had the opportunity to see how contracts affect relationships from really all perspectives. I can say there really is no single type of contract that's best suited for all projects or that can directly create a positive or negative impact on relationships between the owner, consultant, and general contractors. There's certainly many points to consider. When determining what kind of contract you'd want to have. Of course, that relationship, as we're talking about, something that is there to promote the achievement of those project goals. But you have to also consider maybe what the owner's organizational experience and maturity in managing projects is, the level of definition of scope of work and the design art, schedule requirements, the budget, requirements for cost certainty, the ability to make flexible changes throughout the program, and generally the appetite for risk. However, with the thoughtful consideration of what the project requirements, the scope and goals of those projects are, and the requirement for collaborations, contract type, as well as specific terms and agreement, can help determine what the best type is for that project. And as such, will appropriately balance the set of responsibilities for each party in turn to assist with a positive communication and relationship, and hopefully the project goals. It can be noted that some contract types, such as design build, generally improve the relationship or communications of the consultant and the general contractor, as usually both sets of scope are under a single contract, and perhaps even with the same company under a single management structure. However, there still may be issues in relation to the relationship with the owner, as there's a certain amount of hesitation regarding risk management with a single organization, as well as the concern for maybe the best cost position based on prevailing market conditions. There's also issues that may arise from the lack of transparency sometimes, because if a contractor is operating under a lump sum, there's not necessarily the need to provide all information back to the client. These are issues that may strain that relationship between at least two parties in that case. Well, in contrast, the design bid build contract separates these key activities of design and construction, which often an owner initially feels lead to greater certainty regarding cost and other benefits. This type of contract often leads to a deterioration of that relationship of the consultant and contractor over time, as there's a lack of alignment or continuity of the two contracts due to errors, omissions between the two individual contracts. Additionally, there's gaps that may lead to numerous change orders, schedules delay, which create, again, tension between all three organizations. That stated, it's always possible through careful alignment of contracts, the possibility of review and preferably input by the consultants and the general contracting firms that can mitigate many of these potential communications and relationship issues. Further to this, the owner can clearly delineate responsibility of each party as well as the project's communications requirements. Another contracting model that we often see with larger projects, especially those managed by government entities, tend to have a more complex arrangement, such as a public-private partnership or P3. I won't speak to the many different variants of P3 contracts, but in nature they're usually much more complex, as they may have that long-term relation between the owner and the proponent consortium that will include your consultant and contractors that extend for many years past the construction completion by having an operational or maintenance scope of work as part of the overall contract. One would assume that in a P3 agreement, there should be a positive relationship between all parties because they're in fact partners as part of a partnership, and they should be striving towards the same goals. However, as P3 agreements typically include several functions, including finance, construction, long-term operational requirements, these relationships can be tested over time. They can be pushed by the community who may have questions from the side of the government entity. These, if they're not set up correctly with the proper operational performance requirements, these targets will generate stress between the groups if they're really not planned for in the right way to set the right targets over time. As such, it's a must for these complex performance terms to be carefully defined so they're achievable and that there are minimal issues related to that long-term operational performance of that built asset. Now, regardless of the contract type, most issues stem from poorly defined contract strategy that doesn't include the management and relationship of the consultants and the contractors by the owner. This can be overcome to a certain extent, careful consideration of responsibilities and requirements, which can be defined through a RACI matrix perhaps. Using a RACI can certainly help determine the appropriate contract type and how to align contracts during their drafting to minimize gaps in scope, as well as develop collaboration requirements. Owners can also develop communication plans to outline communications expectations to meet the project and owner's requirements and include this actually as part of the contract for additional clarity. While there may not be a single magic contract type, the greatest influence on success of a project or program is a clear contracting strategy, which is developed in line with that owner's expectation, as well as potentially having and buy-in from both the consultants and the contractors during that drafting of the contracts. And that's not meant just during negotiations, but early on. Not only will this limit the gaps, but also create for more collaborative project environment from the onset and over time. With that, I hand it back to you, Jesse.
Thanks, Jason. I think in our previous discussion, you'd brought up some interesting points with respect to project delivery method as well.
I did. Are you able to hear me, Jesse?
Yes.
Okay, good. It was a bit of a journey to get on, and yes, I did want to speak a little bit about this. The project delivery method structures relationships at site. It structures the relationships in the construction pyramid. And that structuring of relationships puts parties in certain spots, as any structure would, and sets them up for certain forms of engagement. So let's take a typical design bid build. You have the consultant on one hand contracting with the owner, and then the general contractor on the other contracting with the owner. That structurally can set up conflict, whereby if there is some sort of issue with the asset, it's misfiring in some way, or there is some deficiency, as a litigator, you typically see the general contractor saying, oh, well, that's clearly a design issue. And then from your consultant, they'll say, oh, well, that's a construction deficiency. That just wasn't done correctly. And your owner says, well, I don't really care. I'm just going to sue both of you. So you see structurally how that works out. Different with a project delivery method like design build, for example, where that the two voices talking to the owner aren't there. It's a single voice, that of the design builder speaking to the owner. So there aren't fingers pointing in that way. However, within the design builder itself, you may have an entity that is at once one that constructs and designs, or you might have an entity that has subcontracted for design, let's say. And so that engagement can happen within the design build itself. And there are some cultural differences between general contracting entities and design building ones. And sometimes those cultural differences can come into play and create conflict or engagement. And I'm thinking specifically about methods of compensation. So not abnormal, probably the norm for consultants to be paid for their time on the basis of putting time in, dissimilar from lawyers. And that can create tension in a circumstance where your design builder has contracted for a stipulated price. Moving to a different project delivery method, P3. Very, very complex in terms of how relationships are structured, and you can have entities that are, a consortium of different parties. And so sometimes you'll have a project co-entity contracting with an authority, and that project co-entity consists of a number of different parties that are also your design builder on that project. And so you have parties engaging with themselves through the project delivery method. Insofar as the consultant is concerned, within a P3 structure, you'll have your authority that has its own consultant that has created a series of output specifications and requirements for how the asset is to perform. And the consultant within the house of the project co-entity or the design builder that sits further down in the pyramid, their responsibility will, of course, be to breathe life into those output specs and create the asset through the design that is done. As you go through these different structures, what's key is understanding how they work, how risk is allocated, and then adjusting your pricing and scope accordingly so that risk is managed effectively in the store in which you sit. And as I'll deal with a little bit more when we get into document hygiene, communication and a clear document record, regardless of structure, is absolutely key. And when we spoke earlier, Jesse, I know that Jeff had some good comments too about construction management when it came to project delivery.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah,
So,
I guess.
Go ahead, Jeff.
Sorry, go ahead, Jesse.
Go ahead, Jeff.
Yeah, just a few simple things on our part on the risk side of things. We don't do P3, so I can't speak to that, but we do a lot of construction management and some lump sum bid and design build. And look at the risk. There's the most risk for us is lump sum build, because basically we're put into a box to do what we're supposed to do in the box and told how to do it. And everything in the cost is our responsibility. Mind you, in design build, we have a lot of the similar risk, but we get to choose the box. We get to choose what goes in the box. We get to choose who's with us in the box. So that sense in there, we're given the tools then to make things work in a very collaborative and cooperative environment. And going back to lump sum, as I look at it there, basically, if everyone thinks, well, why would you carry the low bidder? Well, for the contractors who are on this conference in here, if you don't carry the low bidder, you may as well not bid the job, because you're not going to get the job. So you have to carry the low bidder in those aspects, and then hope for the best and try to work it out. But in construction management, that's where the minimal risk is for us, because it's a shared risk. And we go in with an open transparency of things on the table. We discuss, we value engineer, and we award contracts based on a mutual discussion and agreement. So that's why we are doing more construction management than anything else.
Jesse, if I may just jump in here. I mean, I think Joseph provided a really good overview, and I appreciate the comments from Jeff and Jason as well. Ultimately, regardless of the delivery method, you've got some point having to choose a consultant, and certainly want to pick up on what Jeff talks about in terms of looking at that low bid side of things, or low price. I think part of that is kind of the genesis of trouble all down the road. So, our association, on behalf of our member firms, we advocate for a selection process that we call qualification-based selection, which really operates on a philosophy that says, and it doesn't really matter which model we're talking about, because it's ultimately who's retaining the services of the consultant, but it's done on the basis of demonstrated competence and qualifications, and then with the details in terms of terms and conditions and prices just being negotiated on a fair and reasonable basis. And it's a well sort of set out approach to the procurement of consulting services. And in fact, in jurisdictions, certainly in the US at the federal level, and I think most of the 50 states actually require for all of their public related project retaining services of engineers or architects, they are required to use the QBS process. And some studies that were done back in about 2009 or so, again in the States, looking at 200 projects. When the engineering services were set on the basis of QBS, there was a 70% reduction in cost growth for the project, and a 20% reduction in schedule slippage as well. So, and not to suggest, again, this is something that can be applied, and an approach that can be taken regardless of the bidder delivery model, but it's something where we want to, stress getting away from such a price emphasis with respect to consulting engineering services. I think we keep.
If we don't have Jesse, Jesse back?
There he's back.
There we are. No, he's losing his. There we are. There we are.
So I was just introducing the next topic on scope of consultant engagement. So if you haven't already started that, Jeff, I'll turn it over to you in terms of.
Oh, well, he lost his connection. Well, anyway, thanks, Jesse. First, as I mentioned earlier, I'd just like to state that the majority of the work that our firm is engaged in on a regular basis is construction management. So a lot of my comments are stem from this type of engagement. And second, I believe that the majority of the consultants want to do this, want the same thing we do, and that's project success. I'd like to also, I thought it was interesting to pull out some pertinent definitions from the OAA standard contract form for architect services, just to set some parameters. And I've just got a couple short ones in here, but just to kind of give the understanding of what we're working with. The definition of consultant in that contract. Consultant is a person or an entity engaged by a client or the architect to provide services supplementary to those provided by the architect. And the next one is a definition, consultant coordination. So in that contract too, consultant coordination consists of managing the communication between consultants and with the client and providing direction as necessary to give effect to any decisions taken and reviewing the product of the work to assist in identifying conflicts and to monitor compliance with directions. So I think if you follow these definitions in here, we should have easy project success, right? No loss, but I do recommend that you do look at the OAA standard form of contract or any other consultant contract, and maybe Bruce can come in and mention that, and read through them because they do identify what they're supposed to be doing within that environment. So here are some things there that we do to identify any scope gaps with some of the consultant groups. First, we request copies of all the consultant engagements from the owner or the prime consultant, so we can review the scope of services and identify any issues that things that may not align with the project requirements. And obviously realizing that this is not possible in lump sum bid projects, but it's worth these information is worth knowing if you can get access to it. So especially in the construction management world, most owners and consultants will share that information as we do with our contracts. So everyone knows how you're working, and I think that just makes things more clear to everybody. It's also very common now that owner contracts direct with all the various consultants individually, and probably a longer time ago, 10, 15 years ago, that was never happening. It was always, usually everyone was under the architect, but now even the architects are telling the owner that we don't want to do that. And by doing this, I guess, one of the things we look for is there a prime consultant identified in the design team? And they're engaged to manage the consultant group, providing full drawing coordination review. So there's proper lead consultant of the group. And typically this is an architect because that's what we look at anyways. They're the ones that are doing the main drawings and should be in charge. Other critical items that we look for, the number of design meetings included in proposals to make sure it aligns with the complexity of the project. What stages they would deliver design drawings at the 25, 50, and et cetera. What specifications are provided for the tender process, which is really important for us. Who's bidding for permits? It's not always clear, and in a lot of cases it always was considered the consultant would, but some cases now the owners are doing it, and in some cases it's pushed on to us, which we will take on that responsibility sometimes, but depends what the situation is. Shop drawings being reviewed and circulated, and what role does the consultant have in the delivery of as-built drawings? I've seen consultant contracts to us that they're not responsible and they don't review those, and if it says that, everyone wants to know that at the start. So what the documents they're getting delivered to the owner, they're not questioning in the end who's doing what. How are change orders and directives being handled? Who is the payment certifier? And if one is required, and how does that align with the contract between the owner and the CM? Obviously, that ties in heavily with the finance, especially in work that I do in construction management. We're involved in all that. And then another big one here: are all the necessary special consultants onboarded? Building code specialists. 20 years ago, there was never a building code specialist. The architect did the building code review. Now we have that. We have acoustic review, fire suppression consultants, Bulletin 19, shoring design, and obviously one of my favorites, hardware and security. So that's never looked after by anybody, and we're a lot of times left scrambling, figuring that stuff out. But it's important to know early. And is there a requirement for interior design to deal with the finishes? And there again, in most cases, it's considered a separate discipline. Who's coordinating all that interior design work? And we usually expect the architect, but it's not always labeled that way within the contractual arrangements. So how can these gaps be avoided or managed? These are just a few simple suggestions that can be effective. Create a responsibility matrix for the design requirements that you can use as a guideline to help confirm that all the necessary our consultants are brought on board. And obviously, you're not going to do this on a lot of different contractual arrangements. Construction management and design build, it's very useful tool. Be proactive, fair, and cooperative with all the team members. And I think that's was talked about earlier with the consultant group. And this will also help create active and complete documents. Be involved in a page turn at certain stages of the design to help identify items that require more detail and further coordination. If specific consultants are required, suggest firms that you have successfully worked with in the past, because it's only going to improve your chances for getting along with everybody and getting the solution you need. And then last, always remember in the group, I know there's some consultants and lawyers, but for us, always remember we are general contractors, not consultants. So stay in your lane. And that way, everyone needs to do their part to make a project successful.
Yeah, thanks for that, Jeff. And I think you raised a couple of interesting issues there, and one of them was in relation to documents. And you know, when you think about a project, the main document is the contract, and from it flows so many other documents and correspondence and formal communications. In my experience, good document hygiene and strong communication is critical to a successful working relationship with the consultant. And so, Jason, what are some of the most common kind of document management communication issues that arise, and what can be done to avoid those issues?
For sure, yeah. I will first identify some of the, well, probably the trifecta, three of the biggest problems. One is poorly kept records. Two is communication protocols in the contract not followed. And three is poorly drafted communications. And what I want to do with the moment that I have to address your question, Jesse, is talk about the importance of establishing a good, strong project record. And so these comments, of course, apply to consultants, but really they apply to all layers in the construction pyramid. So the first thing I would say is know who is saying what. That is the personnel that are responsible for managing certain jobs. There should be a map and an understanding who is going to be communicating on particular issues. And where are those documents going to be stored? Is it just going to be a long stream of emails for everything, or are we going to have folders for particular issues and particular items and structures within the project that are to be done? Within a litigation context, we call these items, number one, data custodians, and number two, data repositories. So when you find that your project it becomes in trouble, I know Jesse is a fellow litigator, those are the things that we do to try and find the flow of communications on a project, and parties would do well to establish that flow. In terms of the form of the flow, it's the next item I want to talk about. Email, yes. Text, no. So you want to be disciplined in the way that you're communicating with your partners on the site in terms of the form of that communication. A construction site is a complex place, and great relationships and some poor ones develop there, and some informality can sometimes move into that relationship. If you're talking about where you're going for drinks on Friday, fine. But if you're talking about the project, keep it within structured email communications. And with that, as you're communicating, move into point three, communicate in accordance with your contract. It is amazing how many parties don't even read their contract, let alone communicate in accordance with it. And I would strongly encourage parties to use the communication protocols that sit within their contract. If there are notices to be provided of disputes, of changes, provide those notices. I do understand that truly there is a concern amongst some players that they don't want to rock the boat or upset people, but sometimes that is to your prejudice if you fail to communicate in accordance with the contract. And so what I'd say to you, if you feel that tension, if you're concerned about papering the record or looking like you're papering the record in a way that your counterparty won't like, pick up the phone and talk to them. Explain what you're doing. Explain the context of your action so that you can diffuse potential conflict. And then the communication itself. And I'm reminded of my colleague and my mentor's guidance. He has several rules on document hygiene. And this one features prominently, which is don't put anything in a communication that you wouldn't want your mother to read. And if your mother is foul-mouthed, then don't put anything in a communication that you wouldn't want a judge to read, because that is exactly where things can go. So construction sites can be emotionally charged places to be, and tempers can sometimes run high. And if you're about to draft an email rocket that you're really proud of and how you've really got a hold over your counterparty now, just wait a moment. Remember, it's not about irony or one-upping your counterparty. It's about being productive and constructive as you're trying to get a project done. And sometimes seeing that is a real challenge if you're going to hit send right off the bat without speaking to a trusted colleague or just cooling off a little bit before you send it. Gossip? No. Don't gossip in your text. Don't gossip in your email communications, because that can be most embarrassing should matters move into a dispute, or even short of a dispute. It takes away from the professionalism that would otherwise sit within a clean project record, encouraging the development of a project on time and on budget. So with establishing communication protocols in that way, adhering to those rules, the chances of delivering a good project increase and avoiding disputes increases. And if you find yourself in a dispute, you will have a well-structured project record that can help you move through it most effectively, where documents are king through a litigation process. If you just pick up a phone and speak to somebody and no record of it, it is not going to help you should dispute arise.
Thanks, Jason. Those are some excellent comments that brought back some flashbacks for me to having to explain to a judge why a sassy email was sent that was completely inappropriate, and that I think the only value of that was to watch their lawyer do gymnastics to try and explain to a judge why it's not as bad as it looks. But absolutely, document hygiene is important on a project. And one of the first things that I think Jason and I would do on a file when you get a new client is to listen to the story and then look at the documents. And sometimes you have to say to the client, it's nice that you say that happened, but the documents, it's not documented. So it really is important to document where it's necessary. I think another important component of this discussion is complexity of the project. And a number of issues can arise based on the difference in complexity and the technical work on a project, where there's coordination across multiple disciplines of consultants. And there are some projects where you're not dealing with many projects, you're dealing with a prime consultant. And you're just dealing with a number of different disciplines in terms of engineers or architects. So Bruce, maybe you could kind of help us navigate those challenges.
Sure thing. Thanks, Jesse. I think one part of this, follows on from what Jeff was talking about in terms of just the nature of the scope of engagement, and especially when you do have the more complex projects. And I would certainly like to support what he was saying with respect to the utilization of standard form of agreements that exist. There was just earlier, late last year, I guess it was, CCDC issued the CCDC 31 as a new standard form of agreement between owner and consultant. And our own association has worked with the Municipal Engineers Association to develop a standard form of agreement for the contracts between municipalities and engineers for projects at the municipal level. So I think that's the first thing, because one of the challenges that we often see are forms of agreement that are used for consulting, for the engagement of consulting services that seem to come from some other source. Treating the acquisition of engineering services as if you're acquiring road salt or pencils as a commodity kind of thing, and or taking terms and conditions that apply to the actual construction that a GC might see and somehow just including those, block copy over to a consultant's contract, and that's a source of a number of problems. But to get more specific on the issue you just raised with respect to complexity, where you've now got multiple consultants in different areas of specialty and so on, clearly two primary risk things. First, of course, is the chance that, frankly, you're going to get duplication of effort because people don't understand what's his and what's mine and so on, and trying to get two people trying to do the same thing. But frankly, more often than not, the concern is that things are going to fall through the cracks. Everyone assumes that somebody else was doing it, and as a result, nothing actually happens in terms of a certain important piece of work. And what is interesting in this is the whole idea of identifying a prime consultant or somebody who is essentially what PEO, Professional Engineers Ontario, the regulator for engineering in the province, has referred to as a coordinating licensed professional, comes from the inquest that was held into the Algo Mall collapse up in Elliott Lake. And one of the recommendations that came out of that, and I'm just going to quote from it because both the OAA and PEO have issued bulletins to their membership with respect to this idea of identifying a prime consultant. But the recommendation coming out of that inquest says that for the construction of any building requires services of more than one professional consultant, either a professional engineer or an architect should be designated by the owner or the owner's agent as the prime consultant to perform the roles and responsibilities of that position as defined by one or the other of PEO or the OAA. So again, both of those organizations have now issued bulletins with respect to what the roles and responsibilities are. The challenge here, of course, is that neither PEO nor the OAA have the authority to force an owner to actually nominate or identify a prime consultant. So one of the things that we have going on right now, I'm chairing a working committee amongst building officials, engineers, and architects. We get a whole range of common issue questions, but the coordination of professionals is one of the issues that we're looking at. And ultimately, with a potential thrust to change the Building Code Act to require owners to identify an actual prime consultant who would then have the responsibilities as laid out by the PEO and the OAA. So I think that's really the only, I wouldn't say it's an ultimate panacea solution, but nonetheless, I think it's the best step forward to addressing those issues where you've got gaps and or duplication, and ultimately the responsibility does have to fall on the owner to identify that individual.
Absolutely. And I think on a related note, sometimes, and we spoke earlier about consultant scope, and it is important, as you said, Bruce, to have that lead identified by owner. There are also issues with, where a general contractor in relation to, for example, construction certificates, where an owner requires that a general contractor provide proof that work has been certified by an engineer, or an engineer is only able to confirm general conformance. There can be issues with that sort of granularity. So, Bruce, what are some of the issues that arise in that circumstance, and how can they be managed?
Super. Very hypercritical issue right now, because again, with engineering being the regulated profession, it is PEO that establishes what are the standards of practice for the profession. And while they don't have a number of practice standards actually in legislation, one of the ones they do have relates to general review of construction under the Building Code. And they therefore set what that standard is, and that standard is for the engineer to determine, and I'm going to quote here just to be exact, whether the work is in general conformity with the plans and specifications for the building. That's it. There's no reference to certification in the standard. And in fact, the guidance that PEO provides to its members, and we would certainly echo this to our member firms within ACEC Ontario, is that a consultant should not be making any statements ultimately certifying that construction is in conformance with the design documents, because that ultimately implies a guarantee, which can't be supported through the standard of practice of periodic reviews to ensure general conformance. It's those two things that are tied together. Now, I completely agree. I've seen it myself in terms of our member firms being asked or being ultimately required under contract to provide some kind of certification with respect to that. And it's a significant risk issue because it ultimately ties into aspect of the professional liability insurance that's carried by our member firms. And one of the major insurers, Victor, mostly known as NCON, provides advice that basically recommends against any kind of certification because ultimately it does exceed what is the standard of practice for the profession. So if an engineer was to undertake and agree within a contract that they were going to do the certification and then ultimately do it, if something goes sideways, it may be that their professional liability insurance isn't going to cover them because they agreed to practice to a standard that exceeds the standard for the profession. And it's one of these. It's a bit of a catch-22 in some respects, but you can't get around where those risks are. And in fact, bulletins that are issued by Victor itself speak to the idea of do not certify what you have not seen. It really just comes down to something as simple as that. So I fully understand what the owners are looking for in terms of certifications. And I know I've seen, again, contracts that require a certification both from the builder, from the general contractor, as well as from the design side. And I'll let Jeff certainly speak to this, but I suspect it's a little bit easier for the general contractor to make that certification and be able to sort of stand by it than it is for the consultant when the standard of review is just for general conformance.
That's great, Bruce. That's helpful. And I've actually was dealing with this 2 weeks ago on a project. And I think an important component of what Bruce has just discussed is the contract model. So if you're in a P3 or in a design build project where a contractor, you're also taking on the design responsibilities, it's important to know what the owner is expecting in terms of general conformance review or certification, because sometimes in a contract, the word certification is used and not addressed at the time of entering into the contract. And I have seen that blow up mid-contract. So it is a very important point. Another issue is the consultant's role and responsibilities for certain work. So for example, coordination of testing and commissioning, or arranging for peer review of work. And this is sometimes vague in the contract. So Jeff, what are some of the common issues that arise where the consultant's role and scope of engagement isn't well defined in the contract? And how can general contractors manage that risk? Are there any processes that could be implemented to effectively address this issue?
This is a good segue to follow what Bruce was talking about what consultants do and certifications in that. And obviously there's a lot of overlap from the scope of consultants' engagement in this too. And even the engagements that are good, but the good terms that they have in those engagements, they have to be these are all part of the scope of work is part of the consultant's contractual agreements. But there is no doubt we need more scrutiny, physical examination, and checking of the work than what the consultant should do and is contracted for, which I think, Bruce, you alluded to. So that leads into some of these other areas in here, and some of the responsibilities of review fall in the various areas like geotechnical, structural, building envelope, roofing. And I'm going to focus more today just on mechanical, electrical items because there's a very big, vast area that we could talk about. Here are some of the items that we have run into, and specifically in electromechanical. So in these engagements, mechanical electricians are not always contracted to attend regular site meetings, and only for minimal general conformance review as required by code. This can cause delay in dealing with immediate project issues, especially if it's a complicated job and forces you to deal and issue lots of RFIs to get answers that you need, and this obviously would cause delays in timing. Another item is who outlines what commissioning scope is required for electromechanical systems and how trade work is verified on site. Most cases, this really isn't identified and defined very clearly in most of the consultant scopes, And so who's doing that work? Reliance on contracted trades to properly install equipment and ensure everything is working as the consultants designed is not a reality in most cases. And most consultants only provide visual and code compliance, as I mentioned earlier. This leaves a huge gap in the confirmation that the systems were installed and working correctly, and then we get into commissioning engagements. Electrical and mechanical designers are not always looking at all the project drawings during design, so critical coordination between architectural and structural does not always happen, creating significant on-site problems. And obviously this is the norm, but these are things that can happen when you don't have a good prime consultant also. So what can be done to help manage this risk, and what processes can be implemented to effectively address these issues? Here's a few that work for us. In our company here, we employ specific mechanical and electrical specialists and managers to help in our office and staff to better understand the specific issues in those fields and to troubleshoot on site. And this really is also just to help keep projects moving, and also with the trades, even to help them perform so that we can all achieve success on the project. Another big one that we do is a page turn with the consultants. And we do this at usually 50 to 75% of the drawings. And this is just to ensure the quality of the drawings and the specifications are acceptable when they get to tender. Again, leaning towards construction management. This obviously won't happen in the bid spec world. And design build, we would do it because we the whole in-house team on the review of that, not the consultants. We would hire all that out. The other big point here, I think, that works is having discussions early in the project with the owner and the design team on what level of commissioning and review should happen based on the project complexity, and create a responsibility matrix for the project specific commissioning. So that having something to follow on there is critical as far as we're concerned in there, to make sure that in the end you end up with everything working the way it should. And this can also help with creating better specifications, on-site training requirements for specific equipment, and then this will result in a better defined tender process and site implementation. And I think the biggest theme in here, as you can see, is being proactive. It's came out in a lot of the other discussions so far today too, is that's probably one of the best things that can be done, and to dealing with the many complicated challenges that present themselves, I guess, with working with consultants.
Thanks for that, Jeff. One last issue, I think we have about 10 minutes left, that we wanted to discuss was in relation to the constructability of work on projects. This is something that I'm dealing with heavily right now, acting for a general contractor who spent years dealing with constructability issues and a design battle in a design bid build context. So it's a real problem that contractors and consultants deal with. Sometimes, disputes arise where there are potential issues of constructability with the consultant's design. Sometimes it's not even as a result of the consultant's work, but might be reflective of the consultant's relationship with the owner, sole source suppliers, or even an intention to keep costs down, refusal of issuing design related change order. So, Joseph, maybe you could talk a little bit about this. In what circumstances do these issues arise, and how can consultants and general contractors work together with each other and to manage an owner in this context?
Yeah, constructability is often a challenge in projects, especially ones that are a little bit more complex, or they're a specialized building or structure, or they're something that's iconic. We often see these challenges more so with the design build contracts, but you may see them elsewhere as well. So it's not limited to a DBB. That said, in my experience, some of the greatest challenges have come from engaging consultant architects, especially the iconic ones like a Norman Foster or Renzo Piano, on something that's, for like an attractor or an amazing building like a museum, an airport, a hotel, or any other large-scale infrastructure. And of course, it's certainly not limited to those, but we often see it and are faced with the biggest challenges there. Additionally, I found challenges where the owners engage design firms for buildings like hospitals or process plants that are based on new technology or methodology. We've had some real struggles with some of the newer pharmaceutical plants and how they've been designed really without any kind of coordination with the contractors. Quite often we'll see owners thinking it's a cost savings by doing that design bid build, by having the design contractor start up first with the intent to deliver a very mature and detailed design, 60 to 90% in some cases. And then they hand this over to the general contractor, after a procurement process. Quite often, there's this cutting edge design in these complex structures, but there's little real world experience regarding that constructability during that design from that design firm. However, once a general contractor or many of their subs get involved and they're employed, the real scrutiny begins on how these structures can actually be built. The most successful outcome usually occurs when the owner is able to bring on a general contractor, and sometimes these specialized subcontractors during the design for a routine, and I say that routine constructability review. Again, if an owner has the foresight to understand the complexities of this, it's really helpful. And they don't always have to have the actual engagement of the general contractor that may do the final build. But if they can engage a reputable, experienced contractor to come in to do some of these design reviews, it's invaluable. They can provide that constructability insight that many designers may not have. Not only will this result in a more constructible design, but it will, in the long run, reduce claims due to the delays, design changes, material changes, procurement issues, and other changes related to the intended scope of work. So the areas that I see the most success are where the owner realizes there's a need for that collaboration up front, and they will actively seek the experience of a general contractor during that design phase to ensure that once we get to that point of handing over the drawings to start the building, they're in a position to have a design that can be built. And again, Jeff or others, feel free to jump in here, and suggest how this may work better.
Yeah, I'm just going to take this opportunity, thanks, to go back to the whole the procurement of services and qualifications-based selection. I think there's an excellent mapping here by using a QBS process, something that's not going to be focused on getting somebody fast and cheap per se. You allow for design for constructability, you allow for design for operability, and you allow for design for maintainability. It's ultimately, in terms of life cycle impact on the piece of infrastructure that we're talking about, being it a building, being it a water plant, being it a factory, it's the recognition that it is during that design phase when you have the best opportunity, the lowest cost opportunity to actually influence your overall life cycle value. And it is through those kind of things. So it just makes sense to obviously use a process that's going to get you the best qualified individuals who will, and again, it's not all on the shoulders always of the designer. There's definitely collaboration that has to take place, but it's part of a process, and recognizing that indeed you want to look at those qualifications as part of your selection.
Yeah, and I'll just add too, you made a great point there about having input at the 50 and even earlier stages. I think in a lot of cases at 25%, we've been involved in projects that have been designed and been sitting on the shelf for 2 years and been in for permit and been brought as a construction manager. And it's a total nightmare of what was put together because there was no thought process putting 6 different trades together. You have concrete, you have block, you have steel frames, all coming in to do the structure. Had someone sat back and said, how is this going to work when you're tendering this to get the best value? And it was almost impossible to make it work. But it was the worst part was it was almost impossible to have it redesigned because of the timing of doing that, and nobody, obviously consultants on board, they don't want to redraw, and you can I can't blame them for that, but here again, somebody's got to be the prime consultant and sit back. In this case here, there was a weak situation, and everyone just did their own thing, and when it came to the end, it was very complicated, and it was not cost effective, and the owner paid. The job was done in the end, but it certainly could have been done a lot better, and having that input early, I think, is invaluable.
One other quick I'll make is we've had issues with some of our clients here who will try to save costs by doing design to a lower standard. So they're not interested in 3D BIM, which is especially necessary in process plant. And once we brought in the general contractor, they struggled because of the number of clashes that came in. So I think using the appropriate technology at the design phase can really also assist in making this easier transition for constructability.
That's an excellent point. I think that BIM, not enough people are using BIM because we just don't have enough skilled people in our industry or what we're doing. I think the larger the firms in there, there's more ability, but for the most of us medium to smaller firms in here, we're not employing full-time people to do that. But you can't get a better way of doing the clashes, but you also need the experienced people to know what they're putting in there in the BIM model too. And that's where I think we have a weakness in our industry. We don't have enough educated people to put in that role. Usually you need a senior experienced guy who's been there, done that, and knows everything to tell the young kid that's doing the CAD to put it in. And if you have that arrangement, I think that usually best.
Well, I think we're almost at the end of our hour. Thanks to all of the panelists for excellent comments, and I enjoyed that discussion. I'll hand it over to Giovanni to close out the session.
Thank you very much, Jesse. I wanted to once again reiterate the OGCA's thanks of the presenters today, be it Jesse, Bruce, Jason, Jeff, and Joseph. That's a mouthful. Try saying that 3 times fast. Anyway, I will tell you that it was exhilarating. I was hoping to get a little more heated in the debate, but it was very professional. You guys did a fantastic job. Bruce, you definitely represented the consultants and the engineers quite well. And again, Bruce and I, we sit on a number of panels together, and I tend to agree with the quality-based selection. I think it's a far better thing than just always going lowest price. So any municipalities out there that you're listening, you should try piloting a couple of projects with them on just as a comparison point. But that being said, we are bringing our entire symposium, the Educate Me, the virtual symposium, that is, to a close. I wonder, do we have where's my partner in crime, Devin? Is he on? Excellent. Devin,
I'm here.
You're always in the background working. I want to first and foremost thank the overall sponsor, which is Travelers, for their continued support of the symposium, and today being my co-host. I'm not going to say sidekick. Someone wanted me to say sidekick, but I think that I'm your sidekick when it comes down to it. You're the one with the hair. I'm the aerodynamic one. So any closing remarks that you have for us, Devin?
I just want to first of all thank you, Giovanni, for being such a great co-host and doing a great job today. But there's been so many takeaways. I think we can all agree that we've got so much more insight to manage through these issues that were highlighted today than we had going in, and really that dispels that uncertainty that I talked about earlier. To all the participants and the panelists, thank you so much for making this day the success it was. I think a biggest takeaway for me is that with all of these issues, or even new ones going forward, none of us have to face them alone. You've got so much support, and really that's what the OGCA is for. So I think the only other is just the news about the plans for next year, isn't it?
Yeah, well, what we're trying to do is obviously I've been jumping from table to table during the lounge sessions in between in the networking, and letting everyone know that we have our foot firmly placed the throttle when it comes down to the AGM at the end of September and the beginning of October in Quebec City. So I'm hoping to see everyone there in person. That is the goal. And next year we'll be having the symposium in April, again in person. up in Blue Mountain. Again, this has been a bit of a placeholder for everyone, just because you know what, everyone's used to having information from the OGCA in April, and so next year, fingers crossed. God, I hope we're not in a pandemic in another year from now. That would,
got bigger things.
Then we're seriously gonna have to medicate. But just in closing, I do want to thank all of our sponsors, the table sponsors, Alliance Creative, CLAC, Liberty Mutual, Northbridge Insurance, Western Surety, and Rosenberg and Parker. Obviously, we had Marsh and we had Travelers there, and the session sponsors, Concrete Ontario, FCA Insurance Brokers, Marsh Canada Limited, Petra Winter and Associates, Procore Technology, Royal Sun Alliance, Trisura Guaranteed Insurance Company, and Weirfolds LLP. To one and all, thank you very much. You have all made this a resounding success. Even though it was distant, I feel together. And ultimately, we look forward to seeing you in person come September and next year. So in closing, stay safe. I believe it's stay positive, but test negative. Thank you one and all. Have a great weekend. And thank you all for making this a success.